All right, so we're gonna go ahead and we've hit record, so we are now on YouTube. So anything you say, everybody in the world can hear it. So just as you guys, I'm off camera here, but I have copies of student profiles over here. So we'll talk a little bit more about this. It's also available in a Word document format if you prefer to type onto it. Going from someone who has to read these and decipher what's on them, typing is preferred because I can actually read what is typewritten, but I'll do my best with handwritten ones as well. And then, so that's kind of the big piece. I kind of changed up a little bit of how I went through this because I feel like I was kind of being duplicitous with my information. So tonight, hopefully it won't be too long. Hopefully it should be well under an hour. Because I removed some of the stuff that we'll also go over. We will have a couple upcoming nights having to do with financial aid, having to do with four-year college, having to do with two-year college in specific. So we'll cover a few things in all of those different areas, but we're not going to take a super deep dive. This is going to be a kind of a bigger picture look at the senior year in general. And then at each of those events, depending on where students are at, or parents are at, or families are at, they can come to this nights that most apply to them. And we'll take a much, much deeper look at things like financial aid and the FAFSA, how that works, what, I will answer the Cal Grant stuff tonight, but in terms of like calculations, cost of attendance, what do all these acronyms mean, stuff like that, those we'll save for the other night because each one of those will probably take us about an hour each. So to not keep us here till 7 or 8 o'clock tonight, we'll just do the overview today. Before we actually do that, I want to take a minute, and students too, I guess you can write to your parents, on the sheet of paper that you guys got. What I'd like you guys to do, parents especially, sometime during your senior year, your student senior year, your kid is probably going to have a rough go. They will probably cry, even you, Tony. But you will probably, you as parents, students will probably have some ups and downs throughout the year, whether it's frustrations at all the stress that's going on, the different requirements and things that are kind of all coming at once, a rough application results, anything like that. And so what I'd like to take just 2 or 3 minutes to do is have you guys write just an encouraging note. Stick it away somewhere. It's kind of like for emergency purposes, and you can just pull it out if they come home bawling because they got a bad letter in the mail. Okay, and so you can pull it out and just tell them what you like about them, tell them what you're looking forward to seeing going on after they graduate, how results don't define them, anything that you feel like you want to just share with your son or daughter. We'll take 2 minutes. There's some pens and pencils up here. And feel free to take any of this like swag stuff too. I have way too much of it. So take 2 or 3 minutes and then keep it, just fold it up and put it somewhere safe until it's needed or until you feel like it's the right time to give it. Students, you can write to your parents about what you're going to miss about living at home or what you're not going to miss about living at home after you graduate high school. Okay? So I'll give you guys 2 minutes to do that. Take about 30 more seconds. If you don't get a chance to finish or you want to write more, definitely take it with you. You can finish it at home, another place. You can write more, use a different format, paint a picture. So this is a great thing too, once your children do leave, wherever they end up going, to do even when they're gone. Okay, so it's something that, you know, getting something in the mail is always something that's nice when people are in college or away at work or whatever it might be. And so just remember that sometimes a simple thing like writing something down on a piece of paper is nice, because a phone call is great, an email is cool, a video chat's nice, a visit's even better. But sometimes like holding on to that piece of paper and being able to look at it later, even if that day wasn't bad, but when it does come up, is a nice thing to have on hand. So kind of jumping into something a little different. So like I said, I changed up a little bit kind of what we were going to look at today. So I kind of put together last minute somewhat a timeline, and I'll walk through these things. It looks overwhelming all at once, but I'll walk. It kind of is. This will be kind of the primary slide that we'll use for tonight's meeting, and we'll dive in, like I said, into some of the specific different events at some of their own respective information sessions that we'll take a little closer look. So the senior year at a glance really has started, and many students are kind of really up and running with what they're working on already, whether that's their academic classes, looking into colleges, college visits. Some students might even already be applying. Okay? And so one of the biggest components that often gets overlooked sometimes is, and I hear it actually quite often, more from students than from parents, but I've heard it from parents as well, is that, you know, 10th and 11th grade are the most important years of high school. And it is somewhat true that that is accurate. However, the senior year, in my argument, is one of the most important, because, you know, while maybe for courses and GPA on some circumstances, those particular years are the ones that tend to filter to the top, the senior year really is a make it or break it year, because it as we go through the process in June, May, June, July, schools are going to be looking at that senior year and the results of that senior year to determine and basically verify what you've submitted on your application for colleges, for work, even to let you in. Okay, so the senior year is very, very important. And where we end up seeing the biggest impact in that is in academics. So a student tends to be mostly an A student, and kind of they decide, I want to, you know, kind of take it easy. I want to have an easy senior year. You know, I want to be here for only a portion of the day. I want to not take as many AP classes. I kind of did that last year and it kind of got it out of the way. And so in some sense, that is not necessarily a bad idea. And I would definitely probably do the same thing. It is something that people are paying attention to this year. So students, like, people do want to see you pursuing school. They do want to see continued excellence and even growth. Like, so that's one thing just to keep in mind as you're going into the senior year is it is very easy for you guys, especially in your given age and kind of going from kind of like younger teen into adulthood, with a lot more responsibilities and expectations. You know, many of you drive, many of you have jobs. Like, there's a lot of different ways you're being pulled. And so it's very easy to let some of those academics slide in senior year, especially around February or April. Okay, so senioritis is something that you'll hear thrown around, and it is a very real disease. It hits many seniors, whether you're a straight A senior or a straight F senior, you're going to get senioritis. And parents, it's going to frustrate you to heck, and us, it's going to make us be like, what are they doing? Oh my gosh. And seniors often don't know they have it, but it does show every year and a good majority of the class. So maintaining the academic performance is kind of the biggest piece. Okay, as much as all of this other stuff that we're going to discuss matters, the academic component is the largest component. Okay, so keeping those focus and that laser focus on their goal will let them actually meet it. So that lasts all year. Okay, the other piece about senior year, and we will spend a decent component of tonight talking about college in particular, not because college is the only option for seniors or people after high school. Sometimes We like to think it's a great option for most, but it is by far not the only option, and it's by far not the only valid option. Going to work is a very valuable next step. Pursuing a trade school or a junior college is a very valuable next step after high school. The reason why we tend to spend so much time talking about college is because there's many, many steps that have to take place and many, many kind of pieces of that puzzle that happen in this senior year, where some of the other pieces that go into work or things like that have either kind of been going on all throughout high school or don't necessarily kick in until later on, and they're not quite as complicated. Okay, so we do spend a majority of that time. If for some reason you want to talk about trade schools or things like that, that maybe we don't get to spend quite as much time on, we will have an opportunity, and I'll talk about our post-secondary plan meetings. But we tend to not have, because it's not, the majority of our students do go to college at North Tahoe High School, whether it's 2-year, 4-year, or trade school. So we don't have a formalized kind of info night on the other options, but definitely if you're interested in talking about that, we will have some meetings coming up going through that information. And that's these post-secondary plan meetings. So this blue bar here, those are going to be something that I invite students to, okay? In junior year, many of you guys had ILPs or individual learning plan meetings with me. And this is very similar, except that the sole focus is really talking about June 13th comes around, what's happening next. And I say invite students because from this day forward, really, the students are the ones who are responsible. So I invite students. I don't even put a phone call out to parents on this meeting, okay? Because I need the student to start jumping into that role of kind of captain or director of their future. And they will need to, I offer it to them. I will meet with every single one of them, whether they want to or not, but they are the ones that get to choose whether a parent attends that meeting or not. Okay. So I highly, for you guys who are informed here, go home and talk to your children and say, please invite me to this meeting. I'd love to join you. Okay. I highly encourage, I think every parent should come. The reality is we don't get every parent here. And so making it a requirement kind of belabors that process. And so I'd rather sit down early and meet with every single student, and then we can kind of work the parents in if they have questions as we go through the year. Okay, so that's the post-secondary plan meeting. You'll get some information about that. We'll probably start around 2 weeks from now with the goal of kind of being finished right before Thanksgiving break. Okay, so there's a little over, actually there's 99 seniors this year. So it'll kind of be a whirlwind. I'll probably be able to do 3 or 4 a day. And so it'll probably take most of those few weeks to kind of get through everybody. Okay. Moving right along and actually kind of stepping back. So on Friday, we actually have a big deadline coming up for students. And that's if students are going to be changing any classes, the 14th, which is this Friday, is our deadline to do that. Right. And so that is something that's going to be just important because seniors are kind of like freshmen in some ways. Like freshmen come in and they're like, I don't know what to do. And so they're trying to change their schedule a million times. And seniors do the same thing because they know exactly what they want to do, but they want to do it in their own little way and like have many different plans. And so it's kind of like old people and babies. They kind of circle back around. We end up in diapers again. The same thing happens in high school. We kind of end up right where we started a lot of times. And so it is something that just make sure we have adjusted it slightly from years prior. Okay, so it used to be 3 weeks, it's now 2 weeks. Okay, for many different reasons. One, because it's so important to get students in their schedule that they're going to be sticking in as early as possible. Being 3 weeks late to a class, like AP chemistry or things like that, really, really screws up with their progress through the year. So we're trying to push that a little bit quicker. So Friday is that deadline. Wake up. There we go. So when we're looking at senior year, we haven't quite hit the rush yet, okay? Right? We haven't really felt that pressure. We've kind of just started school. In roughly about a month, that rush is going to very, very quickly start coming, okay? And there's a few pieces that we need to know about right off the bat. A few pieces that you guys as seniors can work on now, and parents who can help your students work on now, is many seniors are going to need letters of recommendation. Okay, and so that is a process it is a required part of the Common Application. Okay, and so that is one of many different applications for four-year colleges. Okay, and it's a very popular one because it will go to over 600 different, often private or out-of-state schools, but they all require at least one recommendation from me, and oftentimes one or more recommendations from a teacher. Okay, and so those are things that seniors will need to ask about. Part of that process to kind of trigger that is two primary things. So number one is going to be a personal conversation. Okay, it's kind of like asking for a pretty big favor. Teachers are not required. I'm technically not required. We all really enjoy doing it. Being able to write good things about our students is a privilege, but it is not a requirement. Okay, that's an important thing. So a student should not necessarily walk into our office or up to a teacher and be like, yo, can you write me a letter? Like, that's not really going to fly very well for most people. Some people, like, I wouldn't probably care that much, but other people might. Okay, they're going to take upwards of 1 to 2, maybe even more hours to write a letter that really, really, really impacts people's applications. This and an essay component, when you're looking at an application for a college, is just like an interview. Okay, that's the thing that brings the personalized aspect into that world. Otherwise, you're a piece of paper, you're a transcript, some demographic information. Okay, so it really, really does make a huge difference. So what we need to start that is that personal conversation that usually looks something like, hey, Mr. Ream, you know, I'm applying to X, Y, and Z school. I have a couple of deadlines coming up mid-November. One of my requirements is I need to have a letter of recommendation. I've really enjoyed our conversations in the past. Would you be willing to write one for me? And most likely I will say, sure, no problem. And I'll say, great, here's my senior profile. Okay, and so what that is, this is kind of an extension of a resume. Okay, if you have a resume, many incoming seniors already have resumes from last year's Pathways classes. That's great. Attach it. Okay, and if there's any like repeats on here, feel free to just skip it if it's already on your resume. Okay, but there's a lot of questions, and you know, I tried to write something up that kind of explained why we have you do this, because I get some seniors, rightfully so, saying like, Reem, why are you making me do this? This is like going to take me an hour to do this. And I'm like, well, if we're going to spend an hour for every one of our students, I want to make sure our hour is well worth it. Okay, so it asks questions that we can't necessarily find out or know from looking you up on Aries, reading your transcripts, having a quick 5-minute conversation. Okay, it's going to ask things like, how have you changed since your freshman year? How have you grown? Other questions are like talking about resiliency, how you adapted to a shortcoming or a struggle, and how did you learn to grow into that? Okay, not everything on a recommendation letter is necessarily like focused on how great you are. The actual best recommendation letters are how you've grown, how you are different now from where you have been. Okay, so addressing things like struggles and growth areas like is actually good. Okay, so that is a big component. So please, this is a great thing for students to start working on now, because we will be asking students. I won't start writing one until I have one of these. Okay, most students likely will need it also for things like scholarship applications and the financial aid process too. So it's a good thing for people to do, put aside a little time for that. They do not have to write 6 or 7 of them. Write one, make copies. Okay, it's also available online. I'll show you in just a second where you can find it, where they can actually type onto it. It's much easier for us to read a typewritten one versus a handwritten one most of the time. We will take the handwritten one. So a few more things about letters of recommendation, because that's kind of, again, kind of the start of the process. Those things are going to be, they are confidential. Okay, so, and they're intended to be so. Sometimes people will share theirs. Occasionally I feel like I wrote a really good one, or I had a really good relationship with a student, and I'll just want to share it with them. I think it's a good thing for them to sometimes know, like, I didn't know people thought about me like that. And so occasionally I'll share them. Most of the time I don't. And I would say more often than not, I don't. And part of that is because the people receiving these letters are expecting them to be confidential. Okay, they want to believe that what we are saying is not swayed by thinking other people will see it. Okay, so they want our true, honest opinion. And so that is the agreement. So, like, you know, you can't, sometimes people are like, oh, I didn't get in, so someone must have wrote me a bad letter. And so they'll contact the college. The college won't even give it to you. Okay, so it is considered confidential information. Here at our school, and what I tell teachers and what my own practice is regarding letters and saying yes or no, if I don't feel like I will never write a bad letter. I'm never going to write a student saying, just like throwing them to the curb. You should not let this kid in. They're a horrible person. Like, that's messed up thing to do. Okay. But what I will do is say, I'm sorry, I can't write one for you. I either don't know you well enough. The only time I've ever seen you was when you wanted to change your schedule. The only other thing that we've done was I had to intervene when you were beating someone up in the middle of the quad. Like, probably not going to be a very good recommendation letter on my part. So more often than not, I will say, I'm sorry, I can't write one. Unfortunately, like, teachers can do the same thing. You can find other teachers, other adults. Unfortunately, the counselor letter is one thing that you can't replace. So mine goes with every single application. So you're welcome. But it is also, I realize that I maybe don't know every single student as well as I would like. And so I do, if I can't write a letter, either because I don't know enough about them, I don't feel like we had a very good relationship, then I will typically say no. However, I'm very happy to submit on my behalf someone else's letter who you feel like knows you. My only stipulation is I get to read it. So that's my only stipulation, is like, I want to read it, because I've had that circumstance, and I've had that circumstance where people wrote false information in that letter. So they tried to pass off information the adult was probably potentially not even knowing, and I ended up not sending either. Okay. And so just that's the heads up about letters of recommendation. And so that is a process you can start asking teachers now. There, I will give you a heads up. There are a few teachers on campus that are the big hitters. One of them starts with, the last name starts with a J. The other one starts with the Lefevers. Okay. And so they tend to be the more popular writers. So if you have those people on potentially a writing list, I would try to approach them sooner rather than later, because some of them will take 15 or 20 and sometimes be done. They just won't have time. So, you know, if you are really looking for teachers in particular, you might want to have at least a conversation to start to just put it in their brain. Okay, even if you don't have this stuff quite ready yet. So that's kind of like post-secondary plan, getting through some of this paperwork stuff. And that'll get us kind of into roughly October, November. Okay, there's not a whole lot else that needs to happen right now. The only other piece is down here in this yellow. We're kind of coming out throughout the junior year and into kind of basically through about October, usually at the latest, kind of the research and planning phase. You still have time. Okay, if you're thinking about what I want to do, and again, particular to four-year institutions, that yellow bar extends further if other options are in the plan. Okay, so if a junior college, that tends to go further down here. This bottom bar talks about the college enrollment window at the junior college. It starts a little bit later in the senior year. Okay, so this is kind of the earlier phase, but you could do later. You could go all the way through graduation if you're looking to go to work and refine job skills, internships, resumes, things like that. Okay, so but we are on the way out. So most students should have a rough idea of, at least if I'm applying to schools in the next couple months, a rough idea of where. Okay, and it does not have to be final, it does not have to be complete quite yet, but it should definitely have a good foundation. Okay, the reason being, October and November are the two primary windows, at least in the state of California, but they're very common windows for every application to four-year college. Okay, the UC application is actually already open. Students can access it. I was actually just yesterday in Oakland at the UC conference getting all the latest and greatest information. So I'm going to show you guys just a little bit. So we talked about some of these things. I want to show you some data for some information. And this is not to scare you. This is not to discourage you. This is to give you, and this is what the UC's emphasized, this is to give you a realistic outlook. Okay, so this is last year's class, basically the seniors who graduated last year, anybody that applied to the UC system. Okay, and what they kind of went through, and I just updated all this stuff. So UCLA has the highest number of applications of any college in the United States, by a lot. Okay, so they end up admitting a very, very small portion. Okay, 14%, that's getting into Ivy League numbers. Okay, and the biggest piece that I want you to take away from this is not that, oh my gosh, why should I apply to UCLA now? It's like a shot in the dark. Okay, it's not that, but it is so that you know probably about 97,000 of those students were well qualified students. Okay,
that it's not just about you. Okay, and that's hard to take because we're in a very it's all about me society, and especially in senior year, it's all about me. But it really isn't in this process. It might not be anything that you did or did not do. Sometimes someone else just did it differently. They're doing a different major. They literally called it, we have different buckets to fill. Okay, they have major buckets. They have socioeconomic buckets. They have locational, geographic buckets. So they have a lot of different criteria set forth by a lot of different people, whether that's California legislators, whether that's academic deans in their Senate, a lot of different things that they're looking for. So it does impact how things go. Okay, so it is a somewhat daunting thing. The other piece about this, that why I show this, is because I want to encourage you guys to apply broadly. Okay, if this school, and we'll even call San Diego and Santa Barbara the only schools on your list, you're kind of playing the statistical game against yourself. Okay, so that does not mean that you necessarily have to apply anywhere else on this list, but you might want to vary up your options a little bit, knowing what's going to happen going into it. You might be very well qualified. You might get into all those schools. But again, that's a lot, probably what 70,000 of those people thought too. I'm very well qualified. I wish I should have got in. And we had, so I'll tell you from last year's class, Santa Barbara was the dark horse for some freaky reason. Every single campus on here has increased the number of students they've admitted every single year in the last 10 years. The other piece is most people are like, well, they're just admitting international students for the big bucks. And so the most that they can actually enroll, and admitting and enrolling are two different things. We'll get more into those kind of things on the 4-year college night. They can only enroll 15% maximum, out of state and international. That's a legislator law. So 85% of every single one of those campuses in the undergraduate world is a California resident. Okay, so it is kind of a big deal, but that's the big thing. Did you have a question?
I was just going to say, I just heard legislation was passed to make it so that.
Yes.
I heard 80-20, but I'll take 85.
Yeah, 15 is what they spouted yesterday. And they were very, very specific to correct when someone said 18%.
Yeah.
They're like, no, 15. Everybody correct your notes.
Yeah.
But it was super interesting. If you guys come to the 4-year college one on Friday or a Monday next week, if I don't talk about wait lists, please remind me. It's a longer conversation than I want to have tonight. I learned some pretty good information. That's on the tail end of the process, but please remind me. I'd love to share some information with you because it's pretty important, because we get into that season and people tend to think wait list, cool, I can get in. And it's kind of like this data, unfortunately. So that is kind of the big thing. If you really, really, really want to go to a UC and get a UC education, hit up Merced. Got to live in Merced, but they have a really nice campus, and they usually have they're the most open enrolling school. Okay. Question, yeah.
Oh, are you saying the UCs have to admit 85% Californians?
Yes.
And the 15% limit is on international and out of state?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
How long ago was that passed?
They've been doing close to that for a number of years, but formally, I want to say it's either this last admissions class or this year going forward, relatively recently. And I think a lot because of the backlash that's come from the news and somewhat rightfully so. I mean, they're not, not guilty of anything, but they're, now they're being held a little bit more accountable to that process. Yeah.
Oh, and what did you mean when you said Santa Barbara last year was a dark horse?
I talked to a number of other counselors, colleagues, and they had the weirdest results. People we kind of thought would have a really hard time getting in might have got in. Students that we thought were kind of shoo-ins, for some reason, got denials. So that's what I meant by kind of we were just surprised by many of the results. Yeah.
The application is the same for every UC.
Yes.
Or are the questions different?
They're the same. So both the CSU and the CSU and the UC applications, different applications, and they are
common applications, meaning you apply through the same application to those two different systems, but it is not the common application, big C, big A. Okay, so, but yes, you will complete the same application, literally the same essays, the same information, and it makes it really easy, but not customizable. You just check off the boxes to where you want to apply. You pay the 70-something bucks each one, and then that's it.
Do they know you're applying to the other UCs?
So no.
No. I assume you are.
Yeah, and you should.
Didn't they used to have you rank your first choice?
Not since I've been doing this.
I think they did that when, like, Laura.
Yes.
Back in the olden days.
What about letters of recommendations for UC?
Yeah, so letters of recommendation. So none of the UCs require or want any recommendations. The only thing, so kind of to give you the overview, and this kind of, it's a natural segue into kind of what we were going to talk about next. I'm going to kind of go back and take this scary screen off the screen. So the UC and CSU application, I was talking about, the UC application is now open. It opened on October 1st to start completing. You can only submit those, however, in the month of November. Okay, so that's where that little red box is. Okay, so that November 1st comes around, you can get it all the way finished, except for paying money and hitting submit, until that November 1st. And both the CSU and UC applications are due November 30th. Okay, no extensions. What's that? No such thing as early applications. UCs and CSUs are no early applications.
Isn't there, Cal Maritime has an early?
They might offer it as early, but it's not actually early. So there's
10-1 to 10-31.
So CSUs are open October through November.
Right.
So it's not an actual early application. We'll get into specifics of the different application types at the other event, but in general, early means a benefit. They are most likely going to potentially, they might start reading early, but that doesn't give anybody necessarily a benefit. So CSUs and UCs have done away with early admissions, early access, whatever you want to call it, early decision, a long time ago. And so it's all the same pool. But sometimes they might label things early to get things kind of just let people get done early. But we'll go over that a little more specific.
CSU and UC letter of recommendations you can't submit.
No. So those two, so the CSU application is open a month longer, it's not even open yet. So people can't submit that, even open it up yet. October 1st through November 30th. Open, complete, submit October 1st if you wanted to. Okay, probably shouldn't, but you can.
I want kind of, I hope it's not off, but it's, if you start the application like the first month of October or even 11/1, and you pay and you submit, and you then later think before the 11:30, I want to add to it, is that possible? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah. So you're actually submitting one at a time. So with the CSU app, you'll complete the same app. You basically should, in the best practice, is actually complete one application all the way through, and then add the second school you're going to be applying to, and it will populate everything in there. And really, you just skip through, hit submit, and go through. Where people actually screw it up is when they open up several different ones at the same time, and that's where it kind of gets really wonky. So just the message is open one, submit one, and the rest of them will take less than 5 minutes each. You just literally go through, plug in your credit card number. Yeah, it's all about money. You'll find that out very, very quickly. Yes, your credit card number. Applying to college typically costs between $200 and $600 just for the applications, sending test scores, application fees, things like that. And college tuition's a whole nother game, but even in senior year, you're going to be putting down between $500 to $1,500 in deposits, things like that too. So, so moving out of the window, kind of starting at the easiest level. So the CSU application is going to be the easiest level of application that anyone's going to submit. Okay, super simple. Probably takes students no more than an hour to complete. And again, all 23 of them, you just check off, you just add another school, and it all goes to the same place. CSUs, though, are the most rudimentary in terms of what they're actually reviewing. Okay, your student comes down to a number and a calculation. GPA, test score, and they look at the course kind of history that students have taken. Okay, times a coefficient and some math, and then your
spit out what's called an eligibility index. And that's what they use. Every major in school typically has eligibility indexes. It's different for in-state, out-of-state. It's pretty complex. We can break that down more at the other event. But there's no letters, no writing, no essays, no interviews, no community service, nothing. Okay. Hardest part about that application is actually entering your classes correctly.
Yeah.
And I say that without, like, no joke. 98% of every, I don't know if I've ever seen a perfect CSU application walk into my office and out. They enter PE, they enter non-A through G classes, like.
And all they want is A through G
Yes.
classes? Okay, thank you, that's good to know.
Yeah, so we haven't talked to the students necessarily about this yet. They're gonna get their transcripts, which we'll briefly mention tonight too, to go over that, to make sure you have all your, like, graduation requirements and fun stuff like that, so you can get out of here, but also checking A through G requirements and stuff too. Okay, so that's happening on Thursday in your Pathways class. So CSU application is very simple. UC applications takes it up a notch. Okay, that's kind of the middle ground between CSU and Common Application. Common Application is probably the most in-depth. The UC kind of finds a happy medium in between those two. A lot of the same information goes on to the UC app. They're actually very close systems. They come together for the same requirements and such, but they have two separate applications. And so what will happen is students will submit very similar information about courses. They only want A through G courses again as well. But there are things called personal insight questions, very short responses to you pick 4 out of 8 kind of essay, very broad essay topics, and you submit those. They're about 200, 300 words each. So it's a very short writing component. And then you can include things like community service, extracurriculars, sports, things like that. But there are no letters of recommendation. Okay? There's one exception that I very hesitantly even mention. So UC Berkeley, if needed, can come out and request letters, usually around January, if needed. But do not prepare, do not send, do not even start the letter of recommendation process for any UCs unless they very, very, very specifically ask you to. Okay. One of the biggest things that I'll tell students that you'll hear at the other night about four-year colleges is one of the easiest red flags in the trash can kind of button is if you cannot follow directions. Okay. If a student cannot follow directions on an application, that's why they're there. If they can't follow them, it's pretty simple. They've got 100,000 applications to weed through. You might be a 4.0 student, but if you can't read the directions and do what it's asking you to and double check things, like, it's a pretty easy decision for most colleges. Okay, so please read through them. Sometimes they're confusing, and that's why I'm here. That's why other people are here, people who have done this before. Okay, so please ask questions as you're going through too. So that's kind of in this yellow box, the act and do section. So that's what we're doing. We're filling out applications, we're writing essays, we're getting things done. Okay, and so that usually lasts right around the new year. Most schools, four-year college world schools, will have applications kind of submitted November, December into January maybe. Okay, so every school system might have a different deadline. Some schools are what are called rolling admissions, and there's a whole bunch of different options. So, but that's usually the kind of like window for those applications. Kind of the next step in that process in their senior year is kind of the follow through. And that's when I mentioned in the beginning, the senioritis comes into play, because after it's done, people are like, yes, I'm all done, hit submit. And now what? Okay. This is kind of when some of the financial aid stuff kind of starts to come into play a little bit, scholarships, things like that. But primarily, most of the true work is done for that process until a little later. However, what students tend to not know is as soon as you apply, usually a week or two later, you usually get access to like an applicant portal for every single school that you've applied to. So you're going to be managing several different accounts, several different logins, several different to-do lists that those schools are going to want. Okay. So it's very, very important. We don't have access to this. Your parents don't have access to this. The student is the only one that has access to this. Okay. And every year, it seems like it happens that one student doesn't pay attention to it. They miss a deadline. They miss out on housing because they didn't read their student email. anything like that. So it is on the student's responsibility. So that's where the follow through comes in. They need to, I would suggest just having a weekly check-in. You log in every single week to every single one of those portals, see if there's anything new. It's a primary mode of communication that the schools have with students. So you'll follow through both in that world and the academics, getting you through to about May 1st. May 1st is what we would call kind of the national decision, or I like National Deposit Day. It's when they take more money. When they take more money from you. And so what that means is on that day, that's usually the deadline. Can you do it before? Sure. Many schools will not actually tell you anything about your admissions process until the March, April window anyways. Okay, so you're not even going to know if you're in to place a deposit. And most people, even if you found out a couple of them, some schools will tell you back here, kind of in December, January timeframe. But if you're applying broadly, you're probably going to have a wide range of schools. You're probably going to have some holdouts that are going to be even in the middle of April. Okay, so you will have to wait and see before typical people will probably want, unless your first choice comes back, you're like, sure, and screw everybody else, I'm in. Okay, and you can just go ahead. The biggest thing about that piece is, again, the follow through. There's 100,000 other students waiting for your spot. If that school admits you and you've already deposited somewhere else, your job at the end of the equation is to call that school, all the other schools you're not going to, and saying, thank you, but no thank you, I have this place to deposit elsewhere. It does a couple things. Number one, like I said, we'll talk about is the wait lists. It helps people get off the wait list, okay, when they know they have places that are allocated to you that end up going somewhere else, okay? So that's a process way towards the end of the school year, kind of around AP testing time. June 13th is graduation. Yes?
You said there's follow through with the college websites.
Mm-hmm.
That's after you've submitted your application, but before you've even been admitted.
Correct.
There. So is housing, what else?
So housing housing usually happens kind of in the early spring typically. And housing sometimes will happen before admissions just because they want to see how many people are looking at it. More frequently, you see it after a notice of admissions. It kind of depends on that college's timeline. UCs, for example, like they can't necessarily, they'll notify you in March or April. They can't necessarily figure out housing in a month. So usually they'll have a process back there. And so basically they will use a similar process that I'll go over more in depth about the admissions, kind of like the theory behind admissions with their housing process as well. But they'll have things like, hey, did you submit your transcript potentially if that's needed? Did you submit your test scores? Did you, and kind of just following through and making sure they've received everything, making sure sometimes there's additional documentation, residency information they need. So there's different steps in that process that happen even before admissions. I would venture to guess that majority of it happens after, but there are a few components they should start checking around pretty frequently, especially as the new year rolls over. So that's the big piece. Graduation comes around, students are stoked. They don't come to school, it seems like, the whole last week, 2 weeks of school. But we will do senior checkouts. Okay, at senior checkouts, what happens is I get a whole group of students in the office, everyone waiting, who don't want to be there already. Well, I have to go through about 15, 20 minutes of kind of like information with the students, checking their transcripts to make sure they've actually met all their graduation requirements, collecting data from them. They get all their information. We order final transcripts, and then they go graduate. We do awards night, okay, and we go from there. So that's kind of the big picture college process. Now let's back it up a little bit and talk about how the heck we're going to pay for this, because that actually starts way back here. So in October 1st is the first day that opens up what's called the FAFSA, the Free Application for Federal Student Aid. The FAFSA is a federal document, okay, and what that is it's actually not too complex when you compare it to some other things. It's not like filing your taxes. You do need your taxes for it, but it's pretty straightforward 95% of the time. There are some complex situations, but most people, I went through it and plugged in a bunch of fake data. As long as you have all your paperwork together, it takes probably less than an hour to actually submit it. In my professional opinion, and I would venture to guess the vast majority of my colleagues in college admissions and counseling would say the same thing, is that 100% of every single family should submit the FAFSA. Okay, and there's a couple different reasons why, and I always get pushed back. They're saying, well, we make too much money. We had 10 kids go through and none of them got any money. Whatever it might be, okay? And my pushback to that is FAFSA is not just for need-based aid. Okay, that's the main purpose. Need-based and merit-based aid are two different types of pools of money. Merit-based is based on what you bring to the table. I'm smart, I am athletic, I have great test scores, I have 6 toes, like on 1 foot, like anything like that's extraordinary or different about you. Need-based aid, you have no, doesn't matter how great or low, kind of it does, but it's all about how much you have or don't have, okay? So those are the two primary pools of money for financial aid. So need-based aid, the FAFSA is the main primary focus of. So they're trying to determine who needs what, and they send that information from the school. The FAFSA actually doesn't just award you anything. The schools are the ones who award you money, okay? But they have to have the FAFSA to determine how much. We'll break down the calculations, what all the stuff means at our financial aid award night. But in general, the FAFSA is also part of merit-based awards often. Okay, and so what that means is if you don't do the FAFSA, you might not need any aid, but I'm pretty sure every billionaire would tell you if someone offered you $100, you take the $100. Like, you know, that's $100 less that you have to spend of your own money. And so the other argument is, well, I don't want to give that information to the government. They have it already. Unless you're a thief and not paying taxes. Like, they already have the information. It's just putting it into a different document. And it's actually private. Like, it's not like there's some concerns like about ICE and like immigration stuff and stuff like that. It's a separate protected area of the government. And so like in general, I understand if people don't want to do it, I'm not going to fight you on it. But in general, the general consensus among financial aid professionals and people in my industry is do the FAFSA, okay? There's a second application in the financial aid world that also is important for about 200 different schools. Many of them are most selective, most expensive, or sometimes the weirdest, but it's called something called a CSS profile. Okay, and the CSS profile is a secondary application. Okay, it's something that, for example, Stanford and a lot of the Ivy Leagues and stuff like that will use because the FAFSA doesn't give them all the information they need to make good decisions about how they award money. Okay, the analogy I use is the FAFSA is the realtor coming over to kind of loosely appraise your house. The CSS profile is the home inspector to come rip up the floorboards. They're going to check everywhere. They account for different things that the FAFSA doesn't. Okay, so it is a pretty important thing. So the biggest piece about that is not every school requires it, but they have different deadlines. So once you have that list of schools, check the financial aid requirements because it will tell you if you need to submit that or not. And if you do, it's usually due kind of like in November versus March when kind of like our California FAFSA deadline is. Okay.
So FAFSA deadline is March.
So the priority deadline in California is March. It's usually second's on a Saturday. So they usually bump it to the next Monday, which I think is the 4th. And so that is the priority deadline, meaning in order to be qualified for things like the Cal Grant, which there is a question at the beginning about Cal Grant, kind of is a nice segue into that, you have to submit but before that deadline. However, the best practice for financial aid is to, and FAFSA and any other financial application is to submit as soon as possible. Okay, it's not like something like you have to rush to be in by like October 2nd, but if you have everything ready, get it done. There's pools of money that are finite. There's pools of money that are much less finite. And so if you're pulling money from finite pools, it can dry up and there's no more money left. So that's the piece why submitting early and they allocate it and then it's allocated.
So those of us who've kind of already done it, but don't have anything,
Uh-huh.
although we filled that out already, do we do we just fill it out once, or do you fill it out for each child?
So each child will get it every year during school.
Okay.
Do you send the student with the link that we could, how do we get the information
You
to?
can just type in FAFSA and the link will pop right up.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So don't worry about it right now. It's not even open. Sometimes people try to do it too early. You'd be filling it out for last year. It starts October 1st, so it's not even available yet. We'll have a specific meeting on the 2nd. The 1st is kind of an odd time. So we'll actually walk through some of it in more depth. But if you wanted to get a head start on the first day before, you definitely can.
Yeah.
But you do fill it out once. So it's a one-time thing per child every year they're in school.
Yeah, that's.
So you do have to do it every year. And that's an important thing to remember. Sometimes it's easy to remember when no one's necessarily prompting you to do it when kids are in college.
Yeah.
It's easy when we're here because we're like, do it, do it, do it.
So is my understanding correct? Our class is filling out our taxes from 2017.
2 years prior.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it should be the
2
stuff
years
that you're
prior.
not filling out this coming spring, but the stuff you've already got completed.
Yeah. And then it adjusts it.
Yeah, it does catch up. So people are like, I had a crappy year that year. And then it's like, sweet, my financial aid's going to be really high. Other people are like, I made a ton of money that year, but I don't usually make that much money.
Sadly, soon enough.
It will catch up though.
Yeah.
So like, it's always 2 years prior. So if you had a bad year and a good year, vice versa, like
Yeah.
it'll right itself. But yeah, so that's the big piece. I don't think this necessarily applies to anybody here right now, but potentially if people are watching, there's also a secondary application in the state of California. So the FAFSA is only open to people with United States citizenship. Okay, and very specific selected criteria. But in general, if students are not citizens, they can apply and go to college. But they cannot complete the FAFSA. They'd have to complete what's called the California DREAM Act, which is a separate application that only applies to California schools, and it helps students receive full in-state tuition, so they can qualify for in-state tuition by meeting there's other criteria. They're just filling out the application, but as well as additional state-based money, but they won't qualify for federal aid. Okay, all that stuff goes in to the magic formula, gets fed out to the schools. You won't get any financial aid information back from schools until after admissions. So usually very shortly after admissions decisions come back, they will send you also what's called the financial aid award letter. We'll spend some time deciphering what that looks like at our financial aid night, but that usually happens kind of in this late springtime. That, in my opinion, is the hardest part of the process. Okay, you got all your decisions back, and then you have to put all the brass tacks to it and say like, well, this is my first choice, but it's $50,000 a year. Not my first choice anymore. The $10,000 a year is more like that was maybe my second or third. Now is my first choice. And I think that's going to be the best kind of middle ground. And that's why applying broadly, but making sure that every single school that you're applying to is somewhere that you'd be happy to go to. Sometimes I get students walk in my office, I look at their list and they're like, that one makes sense. That one makes sense. That one makes sense. Why is that one on there? It doesn't do anything to match this. And 9 times out of 10, they were like, well, I know I can get in there. And I'll say, okay, have you heard of Murphy's Law? And they'll say, no, who's Murphy? And I'll say, well, there's this guy. Yeah. And so he'll go, when you least expect it, Murphy shows up and ruins everything and leaves you with the least expected option. Okay. And so tends to be what happens more likely than not. And they end up having to either choose to go to a school that they had no interest or desire to go to and likely been happy and come back in a year or two, or wait a year, apply again, or go a different route, which is again, it's a different route, not a worse route, and enroll in a junior college and plan on a transfer pathway, but it might just be different than their original intention. Okay. So I hate when people have their plans kind of completely thrown up in the air in the last minute and get disappointed. So applying broadly is definitely encouraged. Let me see. I want to kind of wrap this up here shortly. Talked about most of these things. Like I said, there's a lot of other options out there. Junior college is a great option. The UC starting in next fall, I believe. I don't have all the specifics because they are just coming around with it. They just told us about it yesterday. Is coming up with a better agreement. So more of a true guarantee from junior college to kind of smooth out that transfer process. In addition to supporting California in-state residents, they are also committed to supporting transfer students. So there is also another rule, essentially, to say that for every 2 freshman students that they're admitting 1 transfer student. Okay, so the transfer process to UCs and often CSUs as well is a pretty good option in many cases. Okay, so it does have some benefits. It does come with cons. We'll save that for the other night, but it can be a very nice stepping stone for some students, an option financially for other students, or just a desirable step for students that maybe haven't quite figured out what they want to do, and who, realistically, who knows what they want to do when they're 17, 18 years old? Not many students. It's kind of a cruel game that we put people through, but many systems require you to choose that, and they make it really hard to change it. Okay, so that's an important thing. The military trade vocational schools have similar application types as well. They might not be as rigorous or intensive, and they might spread throughout the year, but they might have a cooking school that has a harder application to complete than the UC system, potentially, with maybe a cooking demonstration or portfolio. The military is a great option for some students, and that's something that we have the different representatives come up here as well for students who are interested in that route. And then going to careers. Gap years are challenging. Just take a minute and talk about gap years, because it tends to be something students start getting interested in their senior year, because they're either they're scared, or they're not quite sure what they want to do next, or they have just a really interesting idea of how they'd like to spend it. Kind of my 2 cents is they are great options. However, students tend to not always have a great idea of how they're going to spend their time and what they're going to leave that gap year with. Okay, so gap year is great if you have a well spelled out, well thought out plan. Backpacking Europe, as much as that's fun, will likely not make you a better student, potentially person. It might make you more worldly and a little bit more experienced. But how is that going? If your goal is to say enroll in a 4-year college and maybe take a gap year and do it the next year, how are you leaving that better than when you're leaving high school? So that's kind of some of the thought processes that people have. I've had tons of people that have great experiences pursuing athletics, pursuing volunteerism, things like that. But I've also had students really struggle with it too, because they didn't spend it very well. And then there's a lot of research that says once you graduate and take time off of education, it is significantly harder to go back and return.
Do the UCs or CSUs accept deferred?
No.
Thank you. I wasn't sure.
So I would say, so what we mean by deferred. So when people say deferred admissions to college, what that means is a student will apply in their senior year of high school, be admitted, and say, I'd like to defer this admissions until next fall. And they will basically not have to go through the application process again. And they can take that gap year knowing they have a spot, usually with a few conditions, but it's not major. It's just don't get arrested, don't do anything stupid, stuff like that. Okay. And so that is most common, oftentimes in smaller, typically liberal arts schools, and usually private. So they are the most frequent ones to offer deferrals. You hardly ever, I would almost venture to say, never see it in larger, especially public institutions. They don't have to with 100,000 people applying to. So what that student would do if we're going to apply to a CSU or UC is they would just take their gap year and they would have to submit their applications in the fall, basically right after they graduate high school, on their gap year. Yeah.
And then the UCs would still only look at 10th grade and 11th
Correct.
grade, even if you took that year off. They wouldn't.
So they do not.
12th grade grades in.
Correct. So they do not consider 12th grade in the admissions process. They do consider what courses students are taking, but it is not part of the GPA calculation. I don't know if I would speak for them and say that they don't, they will see their grades because they're completed. It's a little different situation, but I would venture to say that it probably will not count largely against them if it was bad for some reason. The one thing about time off and deferrals that is very, very important. A lot of times people are like, well, I'm going to take a year off. I'm going to go study somewhere else, or I'm going to go take a couple classes at a junior college. And I want to make sure you guys have big red flags on that stuff. So there are some very, very specific rules, both in the world of admissions and in financial aid, about doing anything outside of high school. So while students can take Sierra College classes now, they can take other courses online. As soon as graduation hits, and I even caution the summer after, but sometimes they make some exceptions for the summer after graduation before they start full time in the fall. If a student takes even one, even non-transferable underwater basket weaving class at a degree granting institution, they are no longer a first-time freshman. They are now an upper division transfer who has to then complete 60 transferable units at a junior college to even apply. So it's super, super specific and super, super strict. Okay, so just be very, very careful about what the plan is after high school. Okay, if like you wanted to contact the school's admissions office, anything that has to do with stuff like that, always get what they say in writing. Okay, never take someone's, talk to someone on the phone and be like, oh yeah, that's cool. You're probably talking to a student, okay, who has no idea what they're talking about. And then when it happens, you go and talk to the director of admissions and they're like, we never said that. Okay, anytime anything like that happens, say, hey, I appreciate that. Can you please follow up with me in writing? Here's my email. Please send me that just so I have it confirmed and I understand it. Okay, because that's a big deal. Big deal. And it's a frequent mistake because people are like, hey, I want to get ahead or I want to do something different. So that, just keep an eye out for that. We talked about this thing. So reach schools, target schools, safety schools. That's the applying broadly idea. Reach schools are going to be your UCLA's, Berkeley's, those guys. Okay, typically if I was to break it down, a good way to kind of start looking at it, it's not the only way, but a good indicator is going to be the admissions percentage. How many people do they accept? Okay, this is probably going to be 25% less, 40, 50%, probably 75, 80% or more they admit. Okay, so the higher your chances of getting in, the admissions, just let me break a little secret to you guys, the admissions percentages have no correlation to the quality of education that your student will get. Okay, the admissions percentages are tied a lot to kind of like brand name, okay, as well as fake rankings. They are really fake, okay? Schools, and they kind of play two-faced. We go to this counselor conference, so they're just talking to counselors, to us, and they're like, so we don't really love these ranking things. And then the first slide that every single school shows up is their ranking. Number one, public institution and blah, 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 blah. Okay, and so they say, oh, we don't pay money for that. We don't game our numbers. They game their numbers. They pay money for it. It's a business for U.S. News and World Report. So do not read too much into it. Okay? It has no implication on your admissions to graduate school. It has no implications on your jobs if you went to a U.S. News and World Report 100 or 500. Okay, what you do at those schools is what makes a difference. Okay, so I think I mentioned probably in a prior meeting about if you want to read a book, it might be a little too late now, but Where You Go Is Not Who You'll Become, I think is a good by, I might be mixing up the title, by Frank Brunei. He's a New York Times author, and he did a lot of research about where the kind of top 100 most prominent figures in the United States, presidents, owners of Fortune 500 companies, congressmen, all have got their degrees. Upwards of probably 60, 70, 80%, public institutions, not on the radar, private schools, like very, very few of them actually attended many of the top, kind of what people would consider the top 10% of schools in America. So it's not about where you go, it's about what you do when you're there. So scary slide. I'm going to save this for the other night. In general, there's two primary application types. Regular is going to be your typical window. The early decision one is the one that I will just caution you about because they do sneak up on us. So I want to make sure you're fully informed of what that means. Early decision, or ED, is often an acronym that you'll see listed next to an application type. What that means is you are signing a binding agreement, meaning a legal contract, that when you submit to this application type, you're typically saying, you're my number one school, I can afford it full price, and if you let me in early, I'm gonna for sure go, okay? So you're signing an agreement that does come with an admissions benefit. It's the only application type that comes with an admissions benefit, okay, on kind of both sides. And what they expect of that is typically you're only allowed to apply to one, okay? And by applying to that one, you usually find out within about a month or two. So usually even before the new year rolls around for many early decision schools, because their deadlines are usually November 1st to November 15th kind of time frame. They will tell you, and as soon as they tell you that you're in, you must then rescind every single application that you have already submitted elsewhere, and you place a deposit immediately, okay? And so there are legal implications if you break that contract, both in the financial sense and other ways. Okay, so it's a very, very important thing just to be aware of. My 2 cents on early decision, it's a great option if that school is your number one choice. If you're going to be like, there's no other school for me, you're the one in my eye, like that's the right spot. Early decision can be helpful, especially if you're kind of right on the edge. Okay, it can help because they know that you are a for sure thing. Whereas those numbers, you see the number of applicants accepted and admitted, okay, those numbers are different. The number they accept is usually about almost 40 to 50% higher than the number that they actually receive. They actually call it yield. It's kind of like a medical term. We yielded this many students, like, you know, it's kind of creepy and disconnected, but they're looking to yield a certain number of students every year. And so they actually have to admit more students, knowing that not every student, you know, Berkeley's going to lose students to UCLA. They're little, you know, baby brother bears. And so they're going to account for that. So it is an important process. Just wrapping up. So seniors are going to get their transcripts. Parents, I encourage you to take a look at them. You can access a lot of that stuff online. When we report things like GPA, typically we're reporting the academic GPA, both weighted and unweighted, usually goes with schools. With your reports. Students, when they're reporting things on like CSU and UC, some people have mentioned like you're only doing 10th and 11th grade. That's true. So the CSU classes as well as, the GPA only includes 10th through 11th grade courses on that GPA calculation. This one that you'll see on Aries on your transcript is fairly close. Okay, so there is an actual calculator that you will plug in on the UC and CSU application. Please use that calculator. Okay. It should come out, it should not be like 2. It should be probably within a couple tenths or hundredths. Okay. It's not, but it's usually not exactly the same. There's a lot of different reasons I won't go into right now. But they do a couple different things with like weighting, how they weight classes and how many they can weight and so on. Okay. But it should be close. So use that as your kind of guiding light. Yes.
So I saw this weird thing on one of the applications. I looked at it where it wanted to, with the weighted, how high a rank could you achieve? How would we know?
How high of GPA you mean?
Yeah.
That
So-
we offer at this school.
What's that?
I think that means that we offer at this school.
So the highest GPA, so the highest weighted GPA that we offer, so it's on a 4.0 scale.
Mm-hmm.
So many times when that question's asked, it's usually at a 4.
Okay.
Technically, if you want to talk technically, the highest GPA anybody could ever technically have would be a 5. There's no way to get higher than a 5. But that would imply that student only took AP classes and got all A's.
Yeah.
They never
So
took
we
a,
put a 4, you think?
yeah, typically it's a 4. Yeah. So that's a question that often's on my report that I send, and it's like, okay, what is your GPA scale? And it's at a 4. And so like the highest non-weighted GPA is anybody could ever get is a 4. Can't go above that. So that's usually what they're referring to. But they give grace on those kind of questions. Like they don't expect you to necessarily know that. It's a detailed question. It's not anything that's going to impact their application. Couple different events. So like I said, we got some 4-year college specific meetings. We'll deep dive into a few of those different areas. If you want to come learn more about the different application types, how enrollment management is actually what it's called, not admissions anymore. Again, clinicalizing it even deeper. And I went to an entire session that they broke down the entire process yesterday, and it's pretty crazy how complex it is even on their side. So we'll deep dive into a couple of those different items on 2 different events. So we have one on Friday at 8 a.m. in the auditorium. So the morning ones will be in the auditorium because this is a classroom. The evening one will be on Monday the 17th at 5 p.m. in here. I'm shooting for about an hour or so for those meetings as well. We'll also have financial aid meeting on October 2nd. That will run longer. It's a fairly complex process. I would guess probably about an hour and a half. But it's pretty detailed and there's a lot of need to know information. Case study will be October 27th. That's a little bit later in the senior timeline. However, it's still a very interesting process. If you haven't been in the past, definitely go because it's super enlightening into what actually happens once you hit submit. Usually when you hit submit, it goes off into the nether until a few months later and you get a piece of paper or an email back. And it's like, what the heck happened? Okay, so you actually get to find out what it looks like. We'll have some great schools coming. We got like Pomona, we got UC Davis will be here, St. Lawrence, who else? University of Chicago, a bunch of different schools. University of Oregon will be here. So it'll be pretty sweet. It is registration only, so please register. There's some links on the website. And again, CSU and UC deadlines, November 30th. Deadlines, and this will be the last thing I say, and then I'll take some questions. But it's super important. Okay. Deadlines at North Tahoe High School are usually pretty weak. Okay. We're like, this is a deadline. Like, it's really not, it's a deadline, but you know, we are smart. I plan ahead. I know people are going to miss the deadline. So I usually set my deadline like 5 days in advance of my actual deadline. Like, I've learned. Okay. However, that is not the college admissions view of deadlines at all. Okay. This is November 30th at 11:59 p.m. As soon as that clock hits over, that server shuts down. Whether you're in the process of processing your credit card, you have just missed out. There are no ifs, ands, or buts. Okay, I've seen another thing that I'll show is the data on wait lists and appeals. Okay, appeals is like, oh, I didn't know I was supposed to enter all of my grades. I only entered half of my grades. Or I missed the date by 5 minutes because blah, blah, blah. Okay, every year colleges get appeals. Not as many as wait lists, but like a couple hundred a year. Most schools accepted 0. A few of them accepted 2. Okay. They do not take excuses. Okay. So my advice about in particular applications is set a week ahead of time of that deadline and just get it in. Don't push it. That November 30th, get it in before Thanksgiving. You get a wonderful Thanksgiving break. Take it easy. Okay. You don't have to worry about the deadline because it has to do, I mean, like there are things about server locations. Okay, they might say 11:59 p.m., but it might not specify unless you read the fine print if it's East Coast time, West Coast time, Mariana Trench time. Like who knows? Okay, so
get a snowstorm.
Yep, your internet goes down, you're out of luck. Okay, so do not push the deadlines. Financial aid deadlines, transcript deadlines, they are very, very strict, and there are no nonsense. And I'm not joking. It's a very disappointing thing when someone misses that deadline. And I have to deal with crying students and crying parents because they were 30 seconds late. Okay. Any questions that you think are good for us to talk about as a group? Cool. If you guys have questions, like I said, we will be having those post-secondary plan meetings coming up in about 2 weeks starting. Though that's a great time to address like individual concerns, like questions that come up on an individual basis for your student. Otherwise, hopefully we'll see you guys either Friday morning or Monday evening for a deeper dive into the four-year college world. We will have a 2-year college information night and financial aid information nights. I'm all about information. I'm like Oprah for information nights. You get an information night. You get an information night.
Thank you.
All right.